Here we go. Can you hear me now? Okay, great. Well, hi everybody. Thanks for having me. So I decided to write it because it was kind of disturbing the speed with which we saw some really dumb narratives being distributed about what happened with Bernie Sanders, losing to Joe Biden, and the speed with which they were coming from pretty powerful outlets was, annoying but kind of disconcerting. And you could tell that basically they Vox and outlets like this had like a ready-made set of things to create the meta narrative of what Bernie did wrong, which is that he should have been nicer. If he had been if he had been not so if you're not beating the drum about political revolution and the Democratic establishment, then he'd be cruising to the nomination right now. I just thought that was just so blatantly bullshit that I thought that we should kind of push back on that. And when I started doing that, I just was like, well, wait, there's a lot I want to say about what happened, because I also noticed a lot of fellow socialists were getting a little down in the mouth about everything. And I think a lot of that stems from the fact that, I'm 38, which I know it's not that old, but to be honest, compared to a lot of Bernie fans, I'm on the older side. A lot of people in DSA, I think, are people who are pretty young and were politicized by 2016. Some of them were politicized after 2016, 2017. And Bernie is kind of like all they knew, all they've known. So I kind of wanted to bring some perspective of someone who was, a college age person for all the 21st century so far. And looking at it from that perspective, I can't understand why anyone would be down in the mouth about what's happened. It's miraculous and wonderful. I wish Bernie could have won the presidency, but I can't believe how far things have come. So I wanted to write about that because it's not like I'm encouraging us to kind of just look at some disaster and like put on a happy face. Like, I think that people should, it would have been great if he won, but I think that we should look at what Bernie did for us as not only did he rally support for, a public goods focused, left politics, which that alone right there is a gift from above. The other thing he did was he basically ran an experiment for all of us. Like he ran a kind of like a artificial intelligence experiment of like what would happen if you ran the Democratic Party electorate on these issues against these forces. And we got to see what would happen. So I think watching what happened answered a lot of questions, a lot of things that the left has been debating about for a long time. And I think we got to get some answers to the question. Well, I'm sure Dustin and I will go into that. But I think that is beyond it. That is just priceless, what has been achieved by just doing that one thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, we've seen a lot of postmortems that have a bit of a shoulda, coulda, woulda aspect to them. What Bernie could have done to have won the Democratic nomination. So your piece doesn't do that. And I'm wondering both why and do you think there's a shoulda, coulda, woulda case that if Bernie had only, we'd have seen a different outcome?
I think the only shoulda, woulda case is, first of all, I think that, for a while there, it looked really good. And I was like, wow, I can't believe this is happening. And I should have realized, well, that's because it wasn't happening. But I don't think there's anything he could have really done differently, because at the end of the day, he ran as, on a political revolution at a time in which even before Hillary Clinton lost, the entire Democratic Party electorate was absorbing this kind of like mass media anti-Trump hysteria, frankly. And I think it just made the Democratic primary electorate was so scared of Trump, so freaked out, even more honestly than after Bush's first 3 years, that I think that was like probably the worst time for Bernie to make his case to a lot of people, because at that point, Obama looks great to to this set of Democratic primary voters, not just the rich liberals that we make fun of, but also like working class Democrats. So I think that was an extremely tough sell, a Bernie program at all during that time. The only way Bernie could have won would be to run as old steady hand of the establishment. But guess what? There, that's just not. You're not going to be able to make that fly when his strength comes from the fact that he's been alone. The lone voice of principle and progressive politics when the rest of the party was, what they were. The only coulda, shoulda, woulda is one aspect, and I think it seems like it's just us venting, but I think it actually has a really important lesson for us, which is the Warren factor. It's easy to mistake if any of you have a kind of feel really pissed off about it in a kind of just like way. You're right to distrust that there's anything there, any lesson. You're right to think like, am I just venting? But no, you're not. There is something there, which is that that is a coulda, shoulda, woulda, in the sense that it's pretty clear that if she had dropped out before Super Tuesday, even if she didn't endorse him, she had dropped out before Super Tuesday, Bernie could have picked up some key victories on Super Tuesday, enough to where he could have stayed in the race before, guess what happened? The political process just shut down. So if that had happened, if we'd hit this coronavirus shutdown with Bernie, closer to neck and neck, I'm not going to say he would have won, but that's a really different universe. So I think that's the one coulda, shoulda, and that was out of Sanders' hands. That was kind of, this is the problem. That was also out of our hands too, in the sense that we didn't have any kind of organization to say, no, there's one leader of the left in America, and it's this person, not you, and you're not running. And if you do, you will not get our official organizational endorsement. In fact, we will go to war against you. That ended up biting us in the ass. And even I felt the sense of, I've always been very skeptical of Warren, to say the least, but even I felt kind of cowed by not only the Sanders campaign, and I can understand why they kind of, they took a path of not, going, negative against her. So that made me think, okay, well, I have this feeling this is really not good she's running, but the Sanders campaign is like hands off. But yeah, in a weird way, I actually think we couldn't have changed this, but her running was a disaster for him. And our lack of an ability to get her out or to make it a clear-cut case that she has nothing to do with a progressive movement in the United States, and she's, hurting it by doing this, that's our failing. So, Ramsay MacDonald, one of the founders of the British Labour Party, when he, went to coalition with the Conservatives, the British Labour Party, they didn't tweet snake emojis. They said, you're out of the Labour Party. You're done. You're gone. His name is a name that a lot of Brits probably don't really know anything associated with the name other than, traitor. So there's something to be said for the power to discipline politicians.
Yeah, wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah.
So one of the things that's interesting about your and I agree with you. I think that the shoulda, coulda, wouldas sort of, they forget how powerful the party establishment is. And in particular, you talked about South Carolina, and last week we had Adolph and Willie Leggett and Cedric Johnson on to talk about South Carolina. And you talk about the power of the party establishment and what it was able to do. Yeah. So can you talk, because the typical Fortress Fairfax story that we like to tell is, these suburban voters will never vote for a social democratic program. And that's true to a certain extent. But what we saw was a lot of working class voters voting for Biden. And that has a lot more to do with what's going on inside the Democratic Party. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, this is something you and I have talked about, which was one thing that was a bit of a bitter pill to swallow, was the realization that that a lot of the Bernie energy in 2016 was an anti-Hillary vote. But that's not something to get like, it wasn't real, because in 1980, did American union households suddenly become free market fundamentalists, and when they decided to swing to Reagan? No, that's politics, right? You can't look at it that way, that, then it wasn't real. But a lot of the 2016 working class support for Bernie apparently was anti-Hillary votes, because we saw that Bernie did pretty poorly in Michigan with union households in a way that he didn't do in 2016. So, Biden was someone who has successfully crafted this image of himself as this. It's ironic because I think that the image he sells to himself is, oh, the old school pre-'80s Democrat, not this like Clinton '90s neoliberal Democrat. And I think they buy it because, one, he's good at the kind of like telegenic kind of like backslapping kind of smiling thing. I mean, we have to accept it. He is good at that, and that does resonate with people. But in a weird way, he seems so old that they assume that he must be like a great society liberal or something, when in fact we know, and it's not something other people would know, but he's, in a weird way, I mean, he was ahead of the curve on the neoliberal turn of the Democratic Party, even more so than Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was somewhat, if you believe the stories from his first term, kind of reluctant about some of those decisions. Biden was early on. He was like what is the recent first adopter? What is the like tech term? Early adopter?
Early adopter, yeah.
Yeah, early adopter. So yeah, but what was your question? Did I answer it?
So the power of the party to sort of guide voters in a certain direction.
Oh, the power of the party. This is something that's important. And Seth had warned me about this going in. He had shown me like, look, here's all the political science about how this works, which is Democratic Party primary voters, when they, they're a small percentage of the general electorate, but they are the percentage that looks to the leaders of the party to get for signs and signals. So if we're like, well, were these voters really paying attention to MSNBC that weekend to look at who endorsed who? The answer is yes. That's what party primary voters do. So that's pretty much, that's the power that is wielded in these things. And it's, to me, the really optimistic sign is that even with all that done, and it was, they were reporting that Obama was part of it. Obama's got to be the most, not sitting politician. He's got to be the most popular president in decades. Even then, Bernie was still getting, 40% of the vote. That's a really good sign. It's really good that even then that Obama doesn't really have as much of a magic touch as he likes to think, and people like to say he has. So that's something to be pretty optimistic about. But it's what we do need to face for the time being is that right now, a substantial part of the Democratic Party, and that includes, stalwart Democratic Party voters and people who show up, even if they like Bernie's program, like it a lot, they'd rather still vote for who the party leadership signals as their person. So that is a major hurdle, and that's something to keep in mind as to you're looking like who to bring over. Like we now know there's a lot of talk about the black vote, and there's no such thing really as like a monolithic black vote. We know that Bernie actually ran really great with black voters in California and the West Coast, but really poorly in the Southeast. But one thing that I think trips people up, and understandably, which is that if you look at the median black Democratic primary voter, even in South Carolina, they're like down the line social Democrats, right? They have like strong support for Medicare for all these things. But at the same time, if they're not willing to buck the party's choice, I think we now know that's not a safe, you can't look at a poll and be like, oh, well, they support Medicare for all and guaranteed income and blah blah blah. They're going to vote for our guy. We now know that even running a half-dead, barely sentient, smiling creature like Biden, if that's who gets the party nods, that's who they're going to go for. So I think one lesson there is a lot of things that the activists have been fighting about, the left is like, well, how do we get, understandably, DSA is a lot of college-educated, middle class, which thus means disproportionately white kids. Well, how do we get like black workers to join? But I think what we see in picking Biden, a man who was, a staunch friend of Strom Thurmond, anti-busing, he's like the last conservative Democrat alive in the true sense of a conservative Democrat. And it didn't hurt him with the black vote. Even Kamala Harris saying like, I was the girl on the bus, didn't do one thing. So the idea that what the left should have done is we should have campaigned harder on, anti-racism or something. I am very skeptical that would have worked. I'm very, very skeptical, which is why I think that the coulda, shoulda, wouldas, I don't think they're that useful.
Yeah, and I think that, today we're seeing Stacey Abrams talk about how she would be a great VP to Biden. So I think that there's a clear move in the party to say we have to somehow figure out how to marry this ultra-conservative Bidenism with, the party's younger wing. But I want to talk a little bit about the future and the optimism, because strangely, after all this talk about the party's against us, the money's against us, the media's against us,
Right.
We've got this sort of behemoth of this kind of phalanx of ruling class opposition, not to even mention, the strength of the Republican Party. Why is there any reason for a Bernie Sanders supporter to be optimistic in the future?
A Bernie Sanders supporter should be extremely optimistic. And this is like something I tiptoed around on my piece, and I put it at the very end because I knew a lot of Jackman readers would kind of get skeptical about it, which is the generational cohort argument. And let me start this by saying I don't believe in generational politics. It's not real. That's a made up thing. Okay, boomer is not a politics, but at the same time, we can't dismiss the Matt Carpenter and I were talking about this, the overwhelming political science. The overwhelming political science that does identify that there is like generational consensus on the role of the state and what economics and whatever that does harden in your early 20s and early adulthood, and it stays there for life. And yeah, there's a little wiggle room if you get become very rich or you lose all your you were upper middle class, you lose all your money. It probably changes your views, but it's a very real phenomenon. And we can't just say something's because it's liberal political science. Well, we're Marxists. We're not going to listen to liberal political science. We have to interrogate it. Is it true? Is it not? And it looks to be very true. So I really don't see, and knock on wood, well, maybe we'll find out. When you look at the Leviathan of political sentiment for people 45 and under, it's like they're living in a different world. And I went back and I looked at, Gallup's done these polls on, asking the role of the state or whatever in economy or life for decades. And there's been nothing close to the age divide as there is right now between people under 45 and people older than 45. And the other thing that's optimistic about is not even kids. And that's something I get to in my piece. I mean, I'm 38. I mean, am I the youth? I'm married, I have a kid, I have another on the way. Like when you get to be where you're having 42-year-olds having this broad social democratic consensus, and in a weird way, actually more importantly, 42-year-olds that are saying I don't give a shit who Barack Obama taps as his successor. I don't give a shit who Nancy Pelosi says is who we're going with. Like I want universal healthcare. I want this and that. That's a very optimistic thing. They're going to be holding back a enormous number, this giant tide of just honestly having hegemonically social democratic views on politics that is going to make a breakthrough. It might be 20 years, but it's going to happen. I mean, especially when you look at Zoomers, that's the generation under millennials. They were already very pro-socialist, pinko, and all these things. They were a little less anti-capitalist, which I thought was interesting. They're very pro-social, but they didn't have quite as much anti-capitalist sentiment as far as when asked as millennials, probably because they hadn't lived through a horrible economic crash like my generation has. They did as elementary school students. Well, guess what? That's now here. So, I think the only thing that would change this, and I get to this in my piece, is if we have a massive new golden age of capital with 4 or 5% GDP growth. Guess what? I think Piketty's right. I think the future is low growth and expanding inequality. So those conditions that have shaped the left-wing views of the people under 45, those conditions aren't changing anytime soon.
Yeah, and I think that, when people hear the generational argument, they immediately go to the 1960s and they say, oh, well, the flower power kids thought that they would just grow into a political revolution. So what's your response to that? Are we just going to grow up into a Bernie-crat revolution? Or are we just waiting around for the boomers to stop voting?
Oh, well, and to some extent, no. We keep doing everything we're doing because you have to build political power, right? You have to build. Look, nothing happens at all without a rebirth of the labor movement. Nothing. And so that's the first step in all these things. But even that, what you just said about the boomers were never that left wing. Like when you look at who they were voting for, and I put this in my article, McGovern, who was supposedly the guy who won capital L liberals and the kids and African Americans and literally nobody else, he won the youth by like 54-46 against Nixon. That's pretty pathetic. And those were the boomers. So a lot of that idea is it comes from this false notion that boomers were basically like us in political sentiment, and they just hardened and became more conservative. It's not true at all. But no, it's not. We can't be passive about this. The point isn't that we're going to just wait and it's going to fall in our laps. The point is that Bernie probably, he could not have won, right? But what I'm arguing is that the next 15, 20 years is going to see, a lot of social change, a demographic turnover to create a situation where a Bernie could actually overcome these structures.
And I wanted to talk, there's just two more things that I would like you to comment on before you sort of finish up here. And one is, what is different about the Latino vote, and why is it the case that so few media commentators have talked about Bernie's overwhelming strength among Latino voters? And finally, you talked about like the Overton window has shifted, right? Everything has shifted. But what does that really mean? I mean, who cares what voters say they like if they're going to continue to vote for the Dem Party? So those two questions, and then if you want to give some final thoughts.
Right. Well, the Overton window is it's a word I just associate with Glenn Beck. I always forget that it has a meaning outside of Glenn Beck. But no, the Latino voter thing is interesting. And anyone that says, talks about you socialists don't care about people of color, it's kind of, you have your answer there with the fact that no one is talking about this extraordinary thing that's just happened with Latino voters, the largest non-white demographic in America, disproportionately working class. What is different about them? Why, were they breaking for this crazy social democratic insurrection? I think the answer is that they're up for grabs in a way that white workers and black workers and black voters are not with the Democratic Party. They haven't formulated this kind of brokerage system in the Democratic Party in the way that black voters did. Black voters have that system because of great left-wing victories by people whose politics, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, and people whose politics match our own. The irony of history is that created a direct conduit to the leadership of the Democratic Party to, shape black constituencies. So Latino voters, though, are kind of coming to this with, without the ability to have any kind of political broker, which means that they're up for grabs. I mean, let's not forget the Culinary Workers Union, which is largely Latino. They went to they started a media war with Sanders before the Nevada caucus. And I was getting really nervous about that because, Liz Warren played into it. Everyone else in the race was licking their chops, we're going to smash Bernie. But guess what? They didn't, they revolted against their own union leadership to vote for Bernie. So the lesson there is very pragmatic for us, which is why the hell are we not running for congressional seats in New Mexico, where the Democratic Party is very weak, where you have a large Latino population that's clearly up for this? Why is California not our home base? Why are we talking all the time about New York City and Brooklyn? Fuck Brooklyn. I live in Brooklyn. It's it's when you look at the demographics, it's it is so ripe for getting Bernie congressmen and women elected. Matt Karp pointed out that Bernie won 50% in some California congressional districts, and that was in a 7-person race. So, I mean, there is no reason why we couldn't be grabbing those seats within 2 years, honestly. I'm not in DSA, so I don't really know how this, but I really strongly think you guys should figure out a way to coordinate some investment of time, money, and resources into the West.
All right, and final thoughts, Connor. What do you think? What do you think comes next, and what should we be looking at?
Wow. I don't know. We're in a quarantine, so everything just feels on pause. What we should be looking at, I think, what we should be looking at is what does Bernie do now, and more importantly, I think it's time for us, and when I mean us, the broad group of people in the United States who are hardcore Bernie bros, whatever our political ideology specifically is. I think we need Bernie desperately to be in dialogue with us about taking his campaign and moving it towards the creation. And I know Dustin and Jared have written about this, into a party, into a larger membership driven structure, like honestly, something like the DSA, but bigger than DSA, taking like everyone who's like pro Bernie, even if they wouldn't call themselves a socialist, and creating an organization that Bernie himself would say, I'm a member of. And then we could start running candidates saying, I'm a member of this, but I'm running on the Democratic Party ballot line or whatever. That is a must. And I will say that is something I am pessimistic about. If that doesn't happen, the whole thing could be for nothing. The transition from the Bernie campaign 2020 into a membership, I'm not talking about our revolution, a membership driven organization in which people like Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar would identify as members of this organization and run as members of this organization. That is a must.
All right, thank you, Connor, and thanks for joining us. It was really helpful. I think your article for a lot of us was the cathartic postmortem we needed. And somebody put it in the chat for those of you who haven't read it yet. I think you should really read it. I think we're a little bit over time, so that's all right. It's my fault. I'm going to hand it back to Marilyn, and she can introduce the next speaker. Thanks again, Connor.
Thank you. Bye, guys.